All right, welcome everybody. Obviously, it's a brand new year and a whole lot of things going on in 2021 for U.S. soccer as well as the Olympic team. It's our first camp that we've had an opportunity to have together since March, since our last camp was cut a little bit short due to all of the goings on with COVID. So we're eager and excited to get underway here. We've had a couple days of training. The guys look really good, and so far we've been really pleased with what we've gotten. So again, super excited about all of the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. And so if you would like to ask a question, you can go to the bottom of the reaction bar and raise your hand. First up, we'll take Ronald Blum from the Associated Press. Ron, you can unmute your microphone.
Hi, Jason. How are you?
Good, thank you.
When do you anticipate qualifying will take place and where? And because of the pandemic, do you think it'll be harder for you to get access to Europe-based players for qualifying, or just the same as it would have been last year?
Yeah, first our anticipation is for the qualifying tournament to be essentially at the same time it was last year, and that's around the FIFA window in March. So it looks like late March. Nothing's been official or finalized yet, and the location, we expect it to be in the same location as well, which is Guadalajara, Mexico. As far as the call-ups go, I don't anticipate it really being any different than it was last year. It's always difficult with the European clubs because of their season, because of the extended travel that it takes for the players to get there and back, but also because the tournament is essentially a 12-day to 2-week process, and then we need some time with the players to prepare them before that. So it's a long time for the clubs to release their players, and we understand that that's a difficult prospect for a lot of them.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron. Next up, we'll have Brian Scaretta from American Soccer Now. Brian, you can unmute your microphone.
Thank you very much, Jason, for doing this. Two questions, both on Orlando. Obviously, the news broke today that Andres Perea was granted his one-time switch, and this makes him available for your team. Can you explain to him how you see him as a player now, as a potential number 6 for your team or elsewhere in the midfield? And then also, Daryl DK, this is his first time in with you, and perhaps making his first first appearance for a U.S. team in a game, maybe this camp. Discuss how you see him also as a player, because Greg also said he sees him as a guy who could potentially play the forward position in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously both players are interesting for different things. The third Orlando player, which you hadn't mentioned, was Benji Michel. So all of those players, I think, have had pretty breakout seasons in 2020, and all of them earned opportunities with us through their play with their club. As we say, what you do in your club really is going to matter. For us, what you're doing in your club, up until camps and the form that you have right before those camps is really critical. So with all three players, they've had, taken major steps forward with their professional careers, and obviously, it's Daryl's first year. Now, if we speak about the players individually, Andres we find to be a really, really interesting holding midfield player for us, is what we're looking at him as. The amount of ground that he's capable to cover defensively, I think, is a little bit different level than some of the other guys that we have in our pool. His processing of the ball is still learning a little bit about that and what we're looking for in a number 6, but he's showing marked improvement from last camp to this camp. We can already see that he's taking on the ideas and applying himself really well. Daryl is some to learn a little bit about what's different about what Orlando City wants from their striker. Maybe different than what we perhaps looking for in ours, but a super, super good and eager, hungry young player. He really wants to learn. You can pick up on that every time you talk to him and work with him. So eager to see how he progresses through the 2 weeks here. And then Benji, we have had one time. It was a very short camp that we had a couple of summers ago in Salt Lake City, and he has taken a major step forward in his career as well. And is a guy I think that can do some different things than some of the other wingers in our pool, and that's the position we're looking at him in.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Next up, we'll have Julia Poe from the Orlando Sentinel. Julia, you can unmute your line.
Thanks so much. Following up on a couple of those Orlando City players, first off with Daryl, he picked up a knock last camp. I was just kind of wondering how he's doing physically, how he's looking there, and then with Benji, he made that switch to winger last year. What did you see in him last season that earned him the call up, and just kind of how are you looking at this camp in terms of what he needs to do to kind of, move into that pool more permanently?
Yeah. So, Daryl, just from a physical point of view in the last camp, it was only 3 or 4 days into the camp and he had picked up a muscle injury and it was a slight strain. But when you're with the national team, oftentimes you need to understand that if you're not at your best, it's not going to be a great scenario for you. You need to be able to put your best foot forward and perform well enough so that we have a proper judgment on what you're capable of doing. So I think a good decision to kind of leave him out of that one with always the eye that we would bring him back in January. So he has shown no signs of that injury over the first couple of days of training. We're hoping that obviously we can get him, a couple of weeks of good training day over day so that he can continue to apply himself and continue to understand what we're looking for. And yes, with Benji, his changing now to be a wide player, I think is really good for him because if we look at Benji's qualities, one of the things that jumps out at you right away is his electric pace. And you saw in the games in Orlando in this last year, when he would come into those games, oftentimes he was able to make a real imprint on the match. And so, I think a little bit of the question mark for us will be, can he make that same sort of imprint from a starting role? And so that'll be something that we'll have to make a judgment on over these next several weeks.
Thanks, Julia. Next up, we'll have Jeff Carlisle from ESPN. Jeff, you should be able to unmute your line.
Thanks, Chris. Hey, Jason. It seems like there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the start of MLS preseason. Obviously, this camp helps you a ton, but how might that negatively impact your preparations? And do you have like a backup plan to have, say, an additional camp to maybe, handle that situation?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting situation. It feels like with this qualification process, it's been one challenge after another. It seems like there's been one hurdle laid in front of us after another, and we just continue to step over them. So we'll do the same with this. You look at the preseason situation, and you say from a negative point of view, if you take a negative viewpoint of it, you say, man, I'd really like my players to have played 4 or 5 games, to have a full proper preseason with their MLS team so we can roll out into qualification, and those guys are maybe a little bit better in form. But from the other point of view, if that's the case and your MLS season started, now maybe there's a couple of MLS clubs that don't want to release their players. So if we take a positive viewpoint of it, we say, okay, if the MLS season hasn't started, now there doesn't seem to be any good reason for any MLS club to not release all of their players to us. So we think potentially we have a bigger pool to choose from. And then maybe we could have a little bit more time with those players before the actual tournament starts. So we're going to be looking at that possibility to have a little bit of a longer run up to the tournament down in Guadalajara.
Thanks, Jason.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Next up, we'll have Paul Kennedy from Soccer America. Paul, you can unmute your line.
Thanks for doing this today, Jason. Could you please go into a little bit of the conversations you had with Andres Pereira in terms of making the switch of association? And also, was there any ongoing conversations with Efrain Alvarez, who was in the December camp also, about a switch of association or just generally being in this camp?
Yeah, I think as a national team program, we're very interested in young players that can help us. At the end of the day, we want to have the best players available. And so to have a really good look at Andres in December and Efrain in December, we all walked out of those camps thinking to ourselves, man, these guys are really top future potentials. And so, of course, we're going to have conversations with those guys about what the longer term picture will look like. Those types of conversations are, of course, better to come from Greg. I'm the under-23 coach. He's the full national team coach. And I think there needs to be a longer viewpoint for those players. So I know that Greg's had those conversations with those guys, and we'll continue to have ongoing conversations with those guys because we think both of them are future potential important players for our national teams.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Next up, we'll have Brian Strauss from Sports Illustrated. Brian, you can unmute your line.
Thanks. Hey, Jason, good to see you. It's been a while. Thanks for doing this. Can you shed some light, a little bit more light, on what conversations with European clubs, and I realize it's a case-by-case basis, but do you expect to have any European-based players for this competition? And if so, when do those conversations with those clubs start, if they haven't already? Who makes those calls? And what's kind of said on those calls to try to make U.S. soccer's case? Or do you just kind of give up on it and just assume that this tournament in March will be an all MLS tournament?
Yeah, well, let me address the last part first. There's no such thing as give up, where I come from and where I think anybody that works with the national team programs would say the same thing. We're never just going to give up and walk away. You're absolutely correct that all of those European-based players and all of their club situations have to be handled on a case-by-case basis. So we make the requests. I don't think that we'll make some requests that we know for sure we're going to get no's on, but anybody that falls into what we think could even be a 10 to 15% chance, maybe category, we're going to make those phone calls. Those phone calls are made from our general manager, Brian McBride. We've been trying to be very proactive with those conversations and not wait until a couple of days before the qualification, but we're trying to have some of those conversations now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Next up, we'll have Ivis Galarcep from SBI. Ivis, you should be able to unmute your line now.
Jason, wanted to ask you about two players in particular. First, Brian Reynolds. Obviously, he's had a pretty crazy year in terms of breaking through with FC Dallas' first team and really establishing himself. And now he's at the heart of all kinds of transfer rumors with big clubs in Europe. What has impressed you about what you've seen from him and his development? And the other player I wanted to ask you about was Brian Cahill, a player who you got a chance to look at, I remember 2 years ago in that pre-Gold Cup camp, and obviously he's impressed people in Germany. He's already moved up to the 23s. What have you thought of his evolution and where he fits in for your plans?
Yeah, really interesting to see a guy like Brian Reynolds just come onto the scene so fast. It seems like Reggie Cannon was transferred years ago, but it was the summer, I believe. So really, Brian has had an opportunity just for the last 6 months of this, or 4 months of the season, and he's burst onto the scene. Obviously, what we're looking for in national team's program from our outside backs is we need guys that can get all the way forward and can get all the way back. We're looking for quality in the attacking third, and we're looking for quality in 1v1 defending and positional defending to help cover their back four or connect back to their back four. So, he's typical, I think, of a lot of the young outside backs where he's got some of the qualities. He's got a tremendously high amount of potential, but still learning some of the finer details of his position. So really, really interesting to try to continue to monitor him and hopefully get him in more often. The second question was about, I ran on there a little too long. Which player? KO, yeah. So Brian's another, young, interesting prospect. The first time we were able to look at him was in a camp in Annapolis, where he had a little bit of a combined camp there as well, back before the last Gold Cup, and then we actually had him in last January's camp. So interesting to see his development, see him every 6 months or so and see how he's pushing along. Really interesting two-way sort of central midfield player that has tremendous range and capability. And I think, again, another player that you're mostly talking about potential. He's certainly nowhere near his finished product, but I think a guy that has a big, big career in front of him.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ivis. Next up, we'll have Charles Bohm from MLSsoccer.com. Charles, you can unmute your line.
Hey, Jason. Happy New Year, and thanks for talking today. I want to follow up on what Brian asked about the conversations with clubs and maybe expand it to MLS as well, because traditional perception is that the domestic clubs are more amenable to working with you guys. I was just wondering if that's been the case, and if you're comfortable giving any insight into the nature of maybe the pitch that you make to these clubs, because you would think that there would be benefits for the clubs in terms of players in the shop window, or maybe it's a different angle that you come from.
No, yeah, I mean, the first part of the answer is that it's always a club-by-club basis. I think that the different clubs in MLS have different needs or concerns where they're at in their season. Last year we ran into some stuff with CONCACAF Champions League I think maybe there's still a little bit of that possibility for this year, actually. And so we have to have those conversations on a case-by-case basis, kind of see where their club is with their philosophy and how they view it. And of course, every club has different motivations and different ways that they look at national team exposure, especially youth national team exposure. From our point of view, we think that these are tremendous opportunities for the players for two reasons. Number one is obviously to represent your country and experience soccer on an international level. Just the experiences that these players get are, I think, quite unique and really special for players to experience. And number two, of course, is the one that you alluded to. From my point of view, you get these players in front of more scouts that are at different games and being exposed to different coaches watching these games, or different people that are coming from clubs to watch these games. And now you've certainly, I think, increased the market value of the player. So, and I think we're getting more and more of an understanding and appreciation for that, especially with the domestic clubs here in the MLS.
Thank you, Charles. Next up, we'll have John Babiak from SB Nation, Colorado. John, you should be able to unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Brian. Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to you, Coach. Coach, I'm based out here in Denver, cover the Colorado Rapids and players that make the national team. I have a three-player question for you. One is with regards to Sammy Vines. Can you express what impresses you about young Sam and where he still can grow and improve to please you even more? Second question, in the camp, what are your expectations?
Lost him.
And third question, many people out here are a bit surprised that Cole Bassett didn't get called up, given his notoriety in the last season. So perhaps you can share your thoughts about why Cole isn't with you. Thank you.
Yeah, could you, and Happy New Year to you as well, by the way. Could you ask the second part of the question again? Because we lost that connection.
Okay. So first question part was about Sammy Vines.
Yep, Sam.
What impresses you about him, where he can grow and develop?
Yeah.
Expectations for Jonathan Lewis.
Okay, got it. Okay, so Sam Vines, Jonathan Lewis, and then a little bit about Cole Bassett, right?
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, super, yeah. So Sam, I mean, really interesting player from my point of view, because he really wasn't on anybody's radar about a year and a half ago. But again, through his production and through his stepping forward with his career in Colorado, through the opportunity that he was given with the Rapids, he's shown that he was quite a capable player beyond his years, really, as an outside back in MLS. So he pushed his way into the scene, and every time we've had him, we've been more and more impressed. For him to come into this last December camp, I think performed very, very well in that game. He was only afforded 45 minutes because we were mindful of a little bit of an injury situation, but I thought he played extremely well. And so he's a player, I think, that's showing some really interesting stuff. Now, defensively, does he have some room to grow? Could he be a little bit stronger in the 1v1 defending? Could he be a little bit better at his positioning to help cover his center back on his side? And those sorts of things. Defensively, I think there's some room to grow, but he has a real good knack for when to get forward, his timing of when to join attacks, and the service that he provides has been really quite good. So I've been impressed with him. Jonathan Lewis continues to be an interesting guy, and mostly because what he can bring for you in the attacking third, and what he can do for you when the game starts to become more open. I think we've seen through some of his best performances with the Rapids have actually been when he's come off the bench. And again, a guy like Benji Michel, where he has had some major impact on matches when he comes in as a substitute role. So the challenge for him going forward and for this group, right, which is a different age group, is whether he can sustain those things from a starting role, and whether he can really make an impact and be disciplined with some other things from a starting role. So that's where I think his challenge is. With Cole Bassett, he's a player that we had in December. We took a pretty good look at him. Really interesting stuff. I thought he had a terrific season in MLS, and he's very well thought of in the national team's program. I just think from my point of view and looking at the other attacking midfielders in this group, from an experience point of view, from a number of games that they've played professionally, and from the number of number of times we've had them in a camp, that meant that he was left out a little bit, but he certainly will be in contention for the March qualification. And maybe this is a good time to make it clear to everybody that there's no restriction, there's no sense that you have to be part of the January camp with our group in order to make the qualification. I think it's very possible that there will be several players that aren't in this camp that will actually be leaning on for the qualification.
Awesome.
You
Thank
bet.
you, John. We have 2 final questions. First up, we'll have Ryan Tolmich from Bull.com. Ryan, you should be able to unmute your line now.
Hey, Jason. Appreciate you doing this, and two of these guys, and Sam and Brian. And when you look at the U.S. men's national team and the national team program as a whole, fullback has been a position of weakness for the past 10 or so years. And now it seems like there's such a good crop of young, attacking, dynamic fullbacks coming up from your program straight up to the senior team. How do you kind of see that shaking out, and how do you kind of feel about having that group come together like this? How did that kind of happen, that this position is so deep?
I'm a little unsure of how it could have all happened at the same time as far as fullback is concerned. I would say I think left fullback is an area that we continue to sort of look for the answer for long term. Sam falls into a category that you start to think, okay, could he have potential to be a left back solution for the full team going forward? Maybe still a little bit away from that, but I do think he's making himself more and more of a candidate for that. At the right fullback position, obviously we know there's tremendous amount of depth with Serginho Dest, DeAndre Yedlin, Reggie Cannon, now Brian Reynolds, Aaron Herrera is in this group with us, Kyle Duncan. So it seems to be we have no shortage of right-footed fullbacks. I think we have a little bit of dearth still at the left fullback position, but I look at it a little bit more globally and say that the amount of young, super high potential players that have been produced in our soccer system right now is fantastic. And I think there's a whole lot of people that ought to be commended and congratulated for that. I think that we've done a lot of complaining over the past however long it is about lack of development and lack of good coaches in our country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we do need to, when we need to take a moment and say all of the people out there that have been involved in our youth development program have done an amazing job, in my opinion, to get all of these players to the level they're at right now.
That's great. We have 1 final question now from Carlos Eustace of Telemundo. Carlos, you should be able to unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Coach. Speaking of development, I'm going to also focus, this more team-specific than player-specific, but 2 things. 1, how important it is to have a player, for example, like Kate Cowell, who not only qualifies for this Olympic cycle, but also the next one, because of his age, and coming from that, how it's important to have players like JT, like Jackson, like Kate, who are so young, but they're also already seeing minutes on the first team and getting that experience. Like, how does that help you?
Yeah, I think if we look back, if we look back a few cycles, maybe even 1 cycle ago, certainly for the Olympic team, but I know for certain from the under-20s point of view as well, you'd be calling in players into the camp that weren't playing a minute for their club. And so oftentimes you're now trying to work with and really leaning on players that maybe are perhaps not at their best. They're not in form, so to speak. They're not even soccer fit because all they're doing is training and not playing matches. And so now I think we're reaching the next level where these guys are actually getting meaningful minutes with their first teams and playing matches and look match ready. So it's, again, I think we're at a tremendous stage in our soccer development in this country. So couldn't be more pleased about that. And in particular, to speak a little bit about JT, a year ago in March in qualification, we're going into that with 3 goalkeepers that had played 0 match minutes in the last year. I think JT was getting a few matches with the USL team. Matt Freese was getting a few matches with Philadelphia's USL team. And David Ochoa was the one who had played quite a few USL matches, but nobody was playing first team matches. So now we're in a different situation, which I think bodes really, really well for us, where All three of those goalkeepers have gotten first team matches over the last year. All three of those goalkeepers, if they weren't playing with the first team, were playing fairly regular with the USL team. So I think we're in a better space there.